San Antonio, I have often said, is to the Latino community in the United States what Atlanta was to the civil rights movement, the African American movement of the 1960s. There were many, many parallels. When one looks at the incubator role that Atlanta played at Ebenezer Baptist Church and in institutions of Atlanta, one finds the parallel institutions in San Antonio. We had leaders here like Joe Bernal early, the Mayo Group, Congressman Henry B. Gonzalez, and many others in the education sector, in higher education, in local politics, in business. So many institutions that were important to the emergence of Latinos as a force in the country began in San Antonio. This was the city that had the first Spanish language radio programs and eventually radio station in KCOR, first Spanish language television station, KWEX, which became the building block of what is now the Univision system. In addition to that, this is where Southwest Voter Registration Institute was created. This is where COPS got its formation and through the Industrial Areas Foundation. This is where MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, was created, where HACU, the Hispanic Association of Colleges and Universities. I could go on and on in the role that San Antonio played as the birthplace for Latino awareness of civil rights in the United States. Many of these had parallels in the African American community, but it was San Antonio that gave birth to many of these. Some of them have moved on to other parts of the country, but they will always have been created out of the very fertile civil rights energy that was the late 1960s and early 1970s in San Antonio. Okay.
My name is Al Kaufman. I'm an attorney here in San Antonio. I'm a professor at St. Mary's University School of Law. And I just want to talk a little bit about the importance of San Antonio to the whole Mexican-American, Chicano, Latinx movement. So many important national organizations important to the Latino community were started all here in San Antonio. I work for MALDEF, Mexican-American Legal Defense Fund, opened in 1968, and is the leading law firm for our Latinx community in the United States. IDRA, Intercultural Development Research Associates, is probably the leading research group on Latinos in the United States. And then you had COPS, the first IF group was here in San Antonio. The Mexican American Cultural Center, started by Father Elizondo and several nuns, all began to study the effect of the church and Latinos on the church and to increase understanding. So it's just such a wonderful place to have a center to study Mexican Americans. Two areas I'd like to talk about in a little detail if we have time. First is education. That's where I spent most of my legal work. San Antonio was the center of struggles for educational equity in school financing. In two areas, the federal case here, Rodriguez versus San Antonio ISD, with Demetrio Rodriguez, a plaintiff, lived not far from here at Our Lady of Lake University. That was a federal case, and the Supreme Court found 5-4, very tough divided decision that the federal Constitution didn't give rights to the people in poor districts or to the poor districts. But later we did the Edgewood case, and that was a MALDEF case beginning in 1984, and that eventually led to a finding that the whole system of school finance in Texas was unconstitutional. And that was a 1989 decision. Very important, all centered here in San Antonio. We had a big celebration over the Edgewood Stadium to celebrate hopefully the upcoming equity in school finance. And in voting area also, Texas is very important. The Southwest Voter Registration Project was started here with Willie Velasquez. Mexican American Unity Council started here. But that led to litigation. White v. Register is probably still the most important single-member district case where there was a lawsuit brought involving San Antonio to try to break up the state representative districts. There were 10, and they were elected at large, so basically all of them lived in Monte Vista Alamo Heights, and that was broken up to various districts where you began to have Latino and African American representation. And then many later cases, San Antonio single member district case, a whole series of cases all brought related to San Antonio. And in addition, we had a real intense super amount of energy on voting rights. At one time, you had the Southwest Voter Registration Project doing litigation and advocacy, MALDEF doing litigation and advocacy, Texas Rural Legal Aid doing litigation and advocacy, all around voting. And for a while, we were all there in the Petroleum Commerce Building, right on North St. Mary's in San Antonio. So this is certainly a community that has been so important to Latinos in the areas of education and voting rights, as well as a wide variety or community organizations and everything. So it's such a pleasure to be able to share with you my memories of that, and I'm looking forward to seeing a lot more research on how these various movements fit together, the change agents involved, how that happened. It's going to be a wonderful future of important research for the Mexican American community.
I remember growing up in the 50s and the 60s as a child in the barrios of San Antonio. And I remember what things were like before the Chicano movement. And I also remember that sense of magic and hope and possibility that came with the movimiento. Before the movimiento, we did not have the rights of normal citizens, of normal residents. We didn't have our streets paved by the city when we complained about charcos that were a foot deep. They said, nobody on the west side has nice cars anyway, so what does it matter? We didn't have libraries in our side of town. They don't know how to read on that side of town. They don't even speak English, so what does it matter? Our schools didn't provide the education, a safe and supportive education that other schools provided for kids. Nothing was safe, not our bodies, not our names, not our language. It was against the state law to speak a foreign language in school grounds. So it didn't matter if you were in first grade or if you were a senior in high school. If a teacher thought they heard you saying something in Spanish, it was one stroke with the paddle, a wooden paddle. Sometimes they had other kinds of paddles. Sometimes they were thicker, sometimes they were thinner. This one had holes in it, so it would travel faster. The child was put in front of the classroom, had to bend over in front of the entire classroom and be hit on the rear end. One stroke for every word in Spanish, judged by somebody who didn't even speak Spanish. So this is what was happening before the movimiento. With the movimiento, and it started really with students, with high school students who began to walk out throughout the nation. Not that we hadn't had complaints and organizations and movements before, not that we hadn't had an adult population that were giving us civil rights training at home and telling us about the injustices that went on and even getting them published in places like San Antonio, where you did have Spanish language newspapers that would publish our issues. But it came public and it came full blown with these high school students across the Southwest that walked out because of these issues. And along with that came speaking out our own concerns, having poets and writers and artists and actors and teatros that gave us a sense of having a voice. 1971, on the west side of San Antonio, a couple of blocks from my grandparents' house, I walked in where there was a sign that said Chicano Times. And there was the Chicano Times magazine, the first issue that they'd had enough money to put out. Very cheap newsprint on the inside and a nice glossy cover that said, Father of the Texas Revolution, Juan Nepomuceno Seguin. Some of us had never heard of Juan Nepomuceno Seguin because we were not in the textbooks. We were not in the history books. We were invisible. We had been deprived of our basic civil rights. And with the movimiento came the effort from so many parts sprouting up like seeds from across what we called Aztlan, the land of our ancestors, showing our art and our words and our movements and our actions. And that was like a blossoming, a bursting forth of all the demand to be treated equally to other residents, to have our streets fixed, to have police protection, be able to send our kids to school without worrying that they're going to be beaten or their name taken away or their language denigrated or them denigrated. This is what the movimiento meant to me, to be able to see finally the fruition of all these years of struggle and complaint and injustice come forth to where people could then tell their stories and say, you know, my grandfather was lynched down in the valley because blah, 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 blah. Do you know that my father fought for this? My mother fought for this. And this is how they were treated. Those stories began to be documented, if not yet in the formal history textbooks, in our own textbooks that we created, in our own newspapers, in our own poems and novels and songs that we preserved. And that was the blossoming for me of the movimiento, the reclaiming of our voice and our rights.